This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Embryos have a 30 to 60% difference in the predisposition to severe diseases. With ORCID, parents can identify their embryo at lowest genetic risk rather than just a random outcome. Our genetic calculator can show the impact of embryo selection. Discuss embryo screening and IVF with a genetics expert. Hey everybody, this is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning Podcast, and I am here today with Dr. Sean Anthony. Dr. Anthony is a professor at The Ohio State. He's a full professor at The Ohio State University, and he is the author of Muhammad and the Empires of Faith, The Making of the Prophet of Islam. So I was telling Sean before I got on, I did read this book. I see that I bought it in 2020. I think I read it in like 2021. And so I'm just going to apologize ahead of time here. I'm not good with Arabic as a language, so I'm going to pronounce things wrong. And, I know I'm going to get some comments about that, but just hold those. I'm just pre-apologizing. Okay. So, first, I guess I want to set the terms of the discussion. Your book, Sean, had a lot of, obviously it had a lot of stuff about the sources. Okay. And would you say you're a historian?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I'm a historian and philologist. Yeah.
Okay. And so philologists is like ancient languages and stuff, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So, you're obviously based in the text and the sources are extremely important. And, it's just, you're constrained by the sources. And in this period that you're studying, a lot of it is 7th century and into the early 8th, I think. The sources get more copious, but, it's still not, we're not talking the 16th century here, it seems like you can master most of the extant sources because they're just like a finite number, right? So Can you go over them for the listener?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's sort of like a general principle, like you said. The closer you get to our day, the thicker the source material is. The farther you get away from today, it literally is more or less possible to read everything out there for any kind of relevant topic that you're interested in. So we could potentially draw upon an array of sources relevant to the life of the Prophet Muhammad that ranges from I don't know, it's like the year 600 to year 1500, because it goes on. People retell these stories over and over and over again. But what generally we try to do in history and in philology is to take the earliest sources that are available, and we try to have as many as possible and that are chronologically close to the events and things like that. But also it's a part of understanding how these sources develop as literary genres as well. Okay, with that being said, our best source, as far as most historians are concerned, is the Quran itself. It's a very difficult source to work with in terms of historical narrative. I don't think it's impossible. I think personally it's been undersold a bit. It's kind of hard to characterize it if you've never read it yourself, but to some extent, I guess if someone knows the Bible, it'd be like trying to reconstruct the life of David from the Psalms or something like this. Most of the chapters of the Quran are written with the divine voice, like either addressing the prophet or an audience or telling stories of the past or reacting to events in somewhat obscure ways, but not necessarily narrating them. But the Quran is generally early. I think there is a strong consensus now that the Quran as we have it is more or less the revelation as given to the Prophet Muhammad. It's his logia. It's like his words, what he claimed to be communicated to him by God. He dies in 632, and our earliest copies of the Quran are 650 is when they start to begin. And we have a pretty comprehensive record of it. It's probably our best. It's definitely our best attested Arabic source.
Wait, can I jump in and ask a question real quick?
Yeah, sure.
So the first Quran, the copies are at 650. In terms of like, okay, how many are you talking about? How are they standardized? How are they compiled? Is it,
Yeah.
because like as you know, but I hope the listeners know, the whole idea of the Quran is like it's in a standard. Well, it's in the style of Arabic, and it's invariant across different cultures. It's not like the King James version versus the New International Version or
Yeah.
whatever, like Egyptian translation into Coptic of the Bible. Like it's the Quran, and there's a standard version for everybody supposedly. But my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that didn't immediately like happen in 650. Like there was some editing going on for a century.
Yeah. So again, we'll use the Bible as like our allegory again, or in our parallel rather, or comparison. So like you said, with the Bible, we have an original language which most of the books were written in. Let's go with the Gospels. For first four Gospels, they were written in Greek originally, but Christianity has like this love affair with vernaculars. So it's very swiftly translated not only into Greek but also into Latin, into Coptic, the language of Egypt, into Armenian, into Syria, the language of the Levant, and so on and so forth. There's a debate whether or not it was ever translated into Arabic before Islam, but we can't really resolve that. But in any case, what's different would be between, like, say, the Christian attitude towards the Bible and this desire to constantly translate it, and the early attitude of Muslims towards the Quran is Arabic is much more a sacred language, lingua sacra, right? And so really the compilation of the Quran and the transmission of the Quran takes place only in the Arabic language. And so most biblical scholars, when they're dealing with the history of the biblical text, they're working with a wide array of languages, Coptic, Syriac, Greek, Latin. But we're talking about the history of the Quran, we're mostly only dealing with Arabic. But when we do deal with Arabic, there is the question of how Arabic itself changes after the rise of Islam. It becomes a literary language, not just a sacred language, but also a language of trade and commerce, a language of the imperial administration. Okay, so how was the Quran first compiled? So this is usually attributed to the third successor of the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad was Muhammad was both a statesman. He founded a polity and a state in 622, and the city called Medina in Arabia, and he dies in 632. They begin to expand in 630, right before his death, but it really takes off subsequently. And the conquests are overseen by successors called caliphs, and it's the third of these that ostensibly compiles it. His name is Othman. Really interesting guy, but in terms of the Quran, it's more or less his version that we have today. And there's a number of ways that we can test this and that we know that this is the case. But there were other efforts to compile the Quran that were earlier, and they no longer survive, and they differ. So they differ, for example, in the order of the chapters. They differ in some of the wordings of the verses. They differ in terms of some of the chapters that are included or not included, very small ones and marginal ones, but there are these differences. And so what we do in the study of ancient texts is what we try to do usually is we take all our oldest copies that survive, and we try to find the text type, or like the original from which it descends. And one of the ways that you do that is you can compare all the different copies, and you can look at the differences between them, usually very minor, and you can tell when they're copying off of a prototype, right? This probably sounds very similar from a geneticist, right?
Exactly. It's very similar.
So, and we have all these probabilities and stuff too that we can use for this as well. And so we like to build these things called a codological stemma. And as far as we can tell, all the copies that we have, with only a couple of exceptions, all adhere to a single text type. And that text type, we think, goes back to 650. And a lot of we have very early in it, and we call it the Uthmanic text type because it corresponds with the reign of this third caliph Uthman. And it's very rare to find a text that does not belong to that quote unquote text type, even though that text type itself has minor variants within it. And one of the reasons why we sort of know this, we have a very important copy of the Quran that was discovered in Yemen in the late 70s. And still has not been fully published, only part of it has. And it has been radiocarbon dated to multiple times and consistently to dating to the middle of the 7th century, with pretty high degree of certainty. We could talk about other dating methods too, if you want to. But it's a palimpsest. So what that means is someone wrote a copy of the Quran. It's written on leather. And then they erased that copy of the Quran and they wrote another version of the Quran. Right. And so we can now reconstruct more or less the erased copy using modern methods. Like one of the things that commonly happens is that the inks that were used at this time had traces of iron in them. And so as the iron oxidizes over time, that undertext becomes visible with the multispectral imaging, UV light, all sorts of other stuff like that. And when we look at that undertext, the erased text, we can see that it was the same text. Right. But there are differences. There's differences in chapter order. There's slight differences in wording and things like this. But it's more or less the same text. So we have a high degree of confidence that the Uthmanic text kind of standardized the text, but it didn't like create it from a whole cloth or de novo or something like that. Yeah. I mean, I guess that's the basic thing.
Mm-hmm.
But most of our early copies are the same text.
Yeah, so you were saying, so I interrupted you just to ask about the Quran, but you were talking about the textual sources and how the Quran is basically like, well, I mean, that's where you start, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's insofar as it's really our earliest text in Arabic, not in the Arabic language at large, but earliest text related to Islam in Arabic that we have. It's the largest. And it's very influential on the language and the themes and the topics of every other Arabic text written thereafter, right? That's like the base text that you learn Arabic from as a kid, learn how to read and write by writing down the Quran and stuff like that. So there's that. And then our other sources that we rely upon mostly are for the life of Muhammad in particular, come in the form of epigraphy. So these are things written on rocks or on the sides of buildings. There's two types of epigraphy. The big kind of things that you see on buildings, like so-and-so built this on this occasion for this reason, right? And then also what we call graffiti. I mean, everybody knows what graffiti is, but it's very common to say, like, whosoever passes by this, say a prayer for so-and-so that his sins are forgiven and let him enter paradise and so on and so forth. And this is pretty widespread as well. And we can see certain themes go in and out of style. We can also see different times, which we call like the increase of epigraphic habit. So so we can have before Islam, no one's writing about, oh Lord, I'm a sinner, forgive me. After Islam happens, people are writing in Arabic all over Arabia and all over the territories that were conquered. Oh Lord, forgive me. I'm a sinner, blah, blah, blah. Why do people all of a sudden become interested in sin and things like this? This is a good historical evidence that a major kind of event happened. And then in addition to that, and I think some of the most fun sources is, and they're surprisingly few. We have a whole slew of sources written in the language of Christian late antiquity. So these are more or less the learned, educated clerical class. For the most part, they're churchmen that write in languages like Syriac, Armenian, Greek, Coptic, and they write what it's like to be conquered by these Arab conquerors, and what it's like to see their society transformed by the conquest. And they also sometimes note the conquerors' religion, their beliefs, their practices, and sometimes they have things to say about Muhammad. Not usually a lot. Like you could probably fit everything they say about the Prophet Muhammad on 20 or 30 pages or so, and that might even be a bit generous. But they do have things to say, and they tend to be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so I reread some of the book, and I've read in this area a little bit, and I think just for the listener who's not familiar with this topic, one of the interesting things to me about the early perception of the Arab conquerors, and I'm going to say Arab conquerors precisely, or I'm going to say this for this reason, is that they're really focused on the Saracens, the Arabs, and the conquerors, whereas I think from our perspective as modern people familiar with Islam, the Arab aspect is like whatever. It's that they had a new religion.
Yeah.
But for some of these, from the perspective of these non-Muslim sources, non-Arab sources, the key was they were raiders. They conquered, and they were ruling. And then, it turned out they had a prophet. They had these weird beliefs, but that was just not a big focus initially.
Yeah. I mean, it's surprising like how little interest. I think from, there's a survivorship bias on the one hand too. Like, so who knows what was written and who knows what doesn't survive? There could be tons of things that were written and that don't survive and things like that. But at least from what we do have, you don't really see like a lot of efforts. Like I'd imagine I'm in Jerusalem and I'm getting conquered, and it would be like, let's find out what the heck these people's motivations are. I wonder what their ideology is. Oh, they have like a text, they have a Quran, they think they have a scripture or whatever. I'm going to try to get a copy and read it and things like that. That takes a while to happen. And it really doesn't begin to happen among like these churchmen until a century after the conquest, when they start writing about what the Quran says, or they even show sort of a broad awareness that there is a thing called the Quran and it has these teachings and stuff like that. Probably our best sense of the idea that Muhammad does have specific teachings and that they follow them does appear in some comments. There's a couple of guys. There's one anonymous historian. We call it the Khuzestan Chronicle. He's from southern Iraq. And he talks about Muhammad as being a leader and having teachings and claiming to be descended from Abraham and things like that. We have another guy that's more northern Mesopotamia named Bar Penkoye, and he talks about the Muslims having their own law, and they consider this guy named Muhammad to be their guide and their teacher. And so there is this idea that they do have a religious difference. They have an ethnicity and things that makes them different, but also they do have real beliefs. And our other really interesting guy is a Armenian historian. Modern historians call him Pseudosabios, because he was misidentified by early modern scholars as this bishop named Sabius. We really don't know who he is. And he talks about Muhammad as being a type of Moses person and claiming to receive revelations on high and things like that. So that stuff is there, but we don't have someone going through and auditing the Quran or reading it in detail until really 100 years later. And interestingly enough, I mean, that's 100 years later is when we start to get our first our first signs of their emerging a sort of what we call like Arab Islamic historiography, a sense of let's write our history, let's write the story, let's kind of talk about how we fit in world history. And they sort of see themselves, when you look at that literature that's mostly written in the middle of the 8th century, as a people of world historical importance, both Arabs and Muslims, including Arabs and non-Arabs. They sort of see themselves as sort of at the climax of world history, as it is, like coming from Adam to the last prophet Muhammad and to establishing this massive empire. And then they kind of seem to expect that they'll rule until the eschaton, until the end of time, the day of judgment.
Okay. I mean, it's a great, I mean, as Americans, I think we kind of relate. But
we're always going to be around.
Let's not go there. So talk a little bit about the Syriac Magazi literature, which is a lot of your book is analyzing this literature.
Yeah. So I mean, this is a really interesting one. It's the Syriac Magazi literature. I don't know. Maybe I'm a bit partial. I really like reading it. It's like an epic literature, and it tells like the epic story, not just of Muhammad, but of his people. And it's, I guess, if we give a quick breakdown of the history of Western scholarship on the life of the Prophet Muhammad, it more or less begins in earnest around the 19th century. And it begins once you have efforts it begins in the West, at least, by scholars, particularly scholars that are in Germany. Some of them are Scotsmen, some of them are English, some of them are French. But predominantly it begins once people get Western scholars get a hold of some of the earliest and best sources that we have for the life of Muhammad. And a lot of the early scholarship is just these scholars trying to get their head around what these narratives say, right? They have studied the Arabic, they've looked at the manuscripts, they've made printed versions, they've collated them, they try to make scholarly editions of them. And just they're more or less trying to get the narrative down. And they tend to be pretty credulous towards how they read the sources. And so they tend to be, this is a little bit too uncharitable, but for simplicity's sake, they tend to be sort of re-narrating these early pietistic sources in the idiom of modern historians, right? So it's like you basically tell the story that's there, but you just take out all the miracles, and that's the life of Muhammad, and that's what happened. That's what really happened. And it takes a while for us to, scholars working in the West, to take a more critical view of the source material and to try to understand how it develops and how the image of Muhammad that it presents, evolved over time. And so you have skepticism, and then you have revisionist skepticism and things like that. I can give you really fast what the most skeptical position is, and then I'll give you kind of mine. So I would say in the late 70s, predominantly in the 80s, and this continued more or less through the 90s, you had this sense that I think was not correct, that all of this source material originates not from the middle of the 8th century or even the early 8th century, early 700s, but rather it only begins to emerge in maybe the 9th century, right? Or even beyond that. And it was seen to be hopelessly tendentious and without any historical value whatsoever. So the usual line was, we have this guy, his name is Ibn Ishaq, son of Isaac is what his name means. And he wrote this big, huge, beautiful history for a caliph named Al-Mansur. This is the founder of Baghdad. And this history begins with Adam, and it goes all the way up to his age of the caliphs, and it includes the life of Muhammad. But that book doesn't survive anymore. We have this edited version that's done by this other guy named Ibn Hisham, and he lived in the middle of the 9th century. And so we have his ideology imposed on an already ideological text as this filter, and that's sort of the source bottleneck. Either you can accept it or you can leave it, but really that's the only game in town. And we really didn't know also at that time how good our evidence for the Quran and its early codification was at that point either. And so what we've had, I think at least, is sort of a couple of revolutions in our thinking about the primary source material. Well, I could say three. The first of them is we were able to show and realize just how early the Quran was codified. And so that gave it renewed importance as our best and earliest source for the life of Muhammad. The second one is Arabists for a long time tended to neglect the Armenian, the Greek, the Coptic, the Syriac, etc. sources. And there's now a kind of fresh evaluation and engagement with these early sources. They're very well known now rather than kind of sitting in obscurity. And the last one is related to this literature about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. I think we've broken that bottleneck. So now we have not just one source that we can go to, but now we have as many as I said we have at least three. I would probably say more. We have at least three sources that date to the middle of the 8th century that tell the life story of the Prophet Muhammad. And that doesn't solve all the historical mysteries or anything, but it puts us in a much better position. And it's, I think, a stronger historical footing for understanding how this literature evolved and seeing that the stories may not be literally true or exactly true, precisely true, but a lot of the stories do fit the cultural context of Arabia in the early 600s pretty well.
Yeah, let me you mentioned Germans in the 19th century, and then obviously over the last couple of decades, if you and I don't feel like this is true for history that doesn't intersect with religion, but I feel like for example, the history of the Bible, there were periods of extreme skepticism, where it's like, oh, these are all like folk heroes that were made up in, the court of King whatever, Jeroboam. And, You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
then like all of a sudden there's like a coin that said King David.
yeah,
You're like, oh, well,
yeah,
and
yeah,
so, but the issue is like, okay, then you have to think about, and like, let me just use the analogy from, I'll use an explicit analogy from archaeology where genetics has said some things just to illustrate like the kind of rethink that has to go on when these data come. There is actually a fair amount of literature on how the corded ware people of the Baltic emerged from the local indigenous populations over thousands of years.
Hmm.
Okay. And then the geneticists took some samples and it's like, no, they're mostly just from the steppe.
no,
But I mean, there's been decades of scholarship citing each other, and you can see explicitly, like you can go in and look in 2015 the reaction of the archaeologists. And the first reaction is not like, "Oh, we were wrong for 40 years,"
yeah, yeah,
because that's 40 years of scholarship,
yeah.
you know.
Mhm.
And so it's taking a little while. It's taken even 10 years later. There's still people that are like, you know, we have all of this work that shows how these potteries are evolving,
Yeah,
and it's always the same people. But we know it's not the same people. We know literally it's not the same people now.
yeah,
But the scholarship is still there, and does that mean that their careers and all of this stuff? And so I just want to bring that up when you're talking about religion, religious studies, like the history of religion. I've seen these swings, or like you can see it in the historiography. Like you can see what the German, you know, modernists or whatever said in the 19th century, and they're basically like it's all made up. Like none of it's real. You know, Jesus didn't exist, Solomon didn't exist. It was all just made up. You know, and so I think that there's some of this that I see, and it's like really difficult to navigate as an outsider in you know, the study of early Islam is like even more fraught for various social political reasons, but also there's just not that many scholars that are doing, I feel like what you are doing, compared to, I mean, how many different study Bibles come out per year with like, you know, the little notes with all the different analyses, right?
yeah,
And so it's like navigating into like this as like an outsider into like these dark waters where like there's no place to anchor. And so, like, you know, I'm just trying to get a sense from you where we are now, and it sounds like some of the hyper skepticism of you know, I don't know how to define it, but it's like basically Islam as a relatively late creation, perhaps of the Abbasid period. I mean, this is a caricature. I don't want to like totally caricature, but some of the skeptics and revisionists, they seem to be basically saying that if you read it as a layperson, and that does not seem to be holding water with the new. I mean, you're talking about like the Quran from Yemen dating to like the 650s. Okay, that's like before the Umayyads. You know, that's early.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it is so I will say that, you know, what happens in fields is that people are trained and they have certain narratives that they use to teach and that they use to create sort of an armature through which they put all these events and peoples and places onto in order to understand it. And when you start like hacking at that or introducing new evidence that creates a problem for that, there's a lot of resistance. I mean, of course, the first um, reaction is always to kind of deny its importance or whatever. So there are definitely people, and some of them are my good friends, that are very keen to dismiss the idea of an early Quran still. Like, so I'm an early Quran proponent, and as far as I'm concerned, I have three main, like, really strong arguments for it. One of them I would say is codological, so what we have in terms of the surviving material evidence of it. The other one I would say is like paleographical, so this is the study of how writing styles change over time and things like that. And then we also have the radiocarbon dating. And radiocarbon dating is probabilistic, is based upon statistics and things like that. And we are dealing with, you know, date ranges and things like this. But at the end of the day, my kind of motto that I always say is that when you're in a good position when you're arguing with the evidence, you tend to be in a bad position when you're arguing against the evidence and trying to find excuses for not integrating it into your system, right? And so far as I can tell, the hyper skeptics, insofar as they still survive and are still writing, they just have a lot of data that they are currently struggling to integrate into their account, right? So how do you explain this? How do you explain that? How do you explain that? It seems that they have, to me at least, many more loose ends than I'd say more my school of thought. I don't know
Sure.
what I would call it, but
Well, I mean, I think some people would say that from Thomas Kuhn, like there's a paradigm, right?
yeah, exactly.
You have your paradigm, you have an interpretative frame. That's what you're saying,
Yeah.
and so I mean, the science is the same. You have a theory, and you have some anomalies in the theory, and you just be like, okay, well, it's just an anomaly. Like, who knows what the providence is? Who knows how the experiment was run?
Yeah.
But then eventually, you're just like, okay, there's just like too many facts. We got to figure out something new, and sometimes the data comes before there's a new theory, and that's a little weird. Like, example I'll give you is Clovis first is this idea that the Clovis culture were the first people in the New World, and that was like the theory for like 30 years. Then like Monteverde, and there are these other sites that basically, I mean, they showed that it can't be right, but nobody had like a replacement theory. And so I read multiple things. They're like, okay, we know it's not right, but let's just go with Clovis first right now because like we don't have any other narrative.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what am I going to put in my syllabus when I?
Yeah. Like I
my lecture.
I literally saw that. I literally saw like people writing things like that because like we don't have, and now they're kind of creating something to replace it. But if you don't have a narrative, you're just going to go to the closest narrative, even if you acknowledge it's kind of wrong. It's not totally wrong. Like there's some features of it that are correct. But if it's wrong in fundamental ways, you got to get a new one. And I think that's what we're getting at here. If you have an interpretive frame, and eventually the interpretive frame might not be useful because there's too many contravening facts, right? And that's that. You're making a judgment that they haven't made yet. Maybe they will make it at some point. So we're talking about like evidence of Muhammad. You're a old Quranist or something. Let's just say like, okay, the 650s. Okay, so there's always already evidence there. But one of the things that I have read, and you kind of indicated in this book, is the references to Muhammad, like in, I don't know, epigraphy is like mentions like like in the archaeological record, really really explode. I don't want to say relatively late, but let's just say like the last quarter of the 700s of the 7th century
of the 600s.
The 600s, yeah, sorry, yeah. So the 7th century, so the last quarter of the 600s, and then it's kind of smooth sailing beyond that. And so what is going? Okay, so the context is like some people have argued that this indicates that Muhammad wasn't as integral to whatever you want to call Islam earlier on. But what is your explanation? Obviously, there's different customs, different practices. I don't know.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things related to that. So the usual interpretation for that is that Muhammad is initially not very important. It's more like this monotheistic idea. And this is particularly popularized by one of my advisors and one of my teachers at Chicago, Fred Donner. And his ideas. Islam is a very ecumenical movement at the very beginning, the Islamic conquest, at least. And so the ideology was very flexible. You had an emphasis on monotheism, but not emphasis on maybe recognizing the Prophet Muhammad as a prophet and an authority and things like that. I have a different view than he does on that. But I would say in general, part of it may be due to survivorship bias. So to have inscriptions by Muslims at all between this very narrow window, right, 632 to around 690, that's only about 60 years. To expect kind of in the epigraphic record for there to appear all of this stuff about Muhammad and things like that, I think maybe it is asking a little bit too much, number one. Number two, I would say that what we have happening in the 690s is now we're getting to generations 2 and 3, and the idea of creating a public facing identity of like, we are these new conquerors, we are Muslims, we are Arabs, we write in Arabic. All of a sudden this becomes a much more important, right? And so a lot of our earliest inscriptions mentioning the name of the Prophet Muhammad are official inscriptions produced by the state. So there are coins that are minted in Syria, for instance. They are large inscriptions written in Arabic on like the Dome of the Rock and things like this. And so they have an ideological program behind them. There are, and the last thing I'll add is, most of our knowledge of Arabic inscriptions have predominantly been from the Levant and from Egypt, from Sinai. And only recently have we had a huge upsurge in our knowledge of inscriptions in the Arabian Peninsula, and in particular, the Hejaz, where Muhammad is from. And the amount of texts that we have there are not just like 1, 2, or 3. We're talking about thousands. And we're still really in the process of sorting them and auditing them and things like that. And not all of them are published. There are inscriptions that I personally think break this kind of rule of thumb that, you don't have mention of Muhammad until 690, but they're not published yet. They're not fully documented yet and things like that. So I believe that that's going to go by the wayside actually pretty quickly. And the last thing that I'll add is that mention of Muhammad and the importance of Muhammad is already all throughout the Quran. And I think that that's the epigraph data is kind of just an accident of survivorship bias as we've perceived the epigraphic record up into this point. But I might be proven wrong, but that's kind of my current view of it.
So, when I read Hoyland's book, and I think he blurbed your book actually. But when I read Hoyland's book years ago, one fact that I remember is that the early Muslims, the Arabs in Damascus, they did not have a separate place of worship from the Christians until the end of the 7th century. Right. So, I guess what I'm asking here is, your thesis advisor. I mean, that actually kind of seems plausible in some way. I mean, let me ask you: would you say that the Umayyads, the Arabs early on, viewed Islam as more of an ethnic religion, and that's one reason they just didn't bother to create their own, because it was going to be their own thing anyway, and they didn't need to make a big public show.
Yeah, one of the big debates is going on right now is like we'll call it the question of Arab ethnogenesis, right? So where do they get this idea that they are Arabs? Where do they get the idea? When did that idea first emerge? They had this collective identity and they called themselves Arabs. When did they get this first idea that we descend from Abraham through Ishmael and stuff like that? Put it simply, the Quran has a really interesting idea. So its view of prophecy is very different from what you get in the Bible. I mean, the idea is still there, right? The idea that God sends an angel or some other intermediary with his word and gives it to a specially chosen human being who then communicates it to humanity. That basic idea of prophecy is already there in the Bible. But the Quran kind of expands all of human history to be about the history of prophets in many ways. Like one of the earliest universal histories written in Arabic is called The History of Prophets and Kings. You get the idea of like their centrality for human history. So Adam was like the first prophet, right? And then you go through history and you have a series of prophets that come. You have Noah, you have Abraham, you have Moses, and you have Jesus, and so on and so forth. And part of the idea of the Quran is that humanity is subdivided. So you have humanity as one level, and then the next level down, humanity is divided into subgroups called ummas, right? So like the United Nations today is called the United Ummas, right? Basically in Arabic. And the idea is that God sends a messenger to every ummah of humanity, every kind of nation of humanity, and he sends it from that nation, usually, and in that nation's language. Right. And so we're like the Arabs are like the last ones. Like they're the only ones that haven't received a message is basically the idea. And so Muhammad is called from his nation. And the Quran doesn't call them Arabs, but it says they do speak Arabic, which I believe implies that they are Arabs, but that's a debate. So he's called from that ummah and he delivers the message for them in Arabic. Right. And so what that tends to entail is this idea, a little bit of an idea of divine election, but there's a problem. And in Arabic, they call this is the issue of Ummat al-Da'wah versus Ummat al-Ijaba, or the Ummah that receives the call and then the Ummah that actually answers it. So what eventually happens is that part of the Ummah that Muhammad comes from that answers the call, like they become really like the new version of the Arab Ummah. And it's their idea of ummah is, it's primarily rooted in the Arabs and the reception of the message and things like that. And Arabness remains kind of a central point, and the Arabic language remains a central point of Islam forever thereafter. But it's also open to non-Arabs, just like Arab tribes are open to non-Arabs. And so, like, our earliest converts to Islam that were non-Arabs, they usually were called clients. In Arabic, they're called mawali. So in order to convert, you literally had to pick a tribe that you would join. You'd have a sponsor, like he would be your patron. And there's kind of this exchange would happen. And usually there would be services rendered. Sometimes people entered into this patronage, clientage relationship through slavery and through manumission and things like that. But in essence, to become a Muslim very early on, if you're a non-Arab, you had to go through this clientage process. That goes by the wayside eventually. But as to the second question, were they very proselytizing? It seems that they were very proselytizing in the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabic speakers of the Arabian Peninsula and the tribal peoples, theoretically at least, had no choice but to convert to Islam. But once they reached Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, they were the tax base. So for the most part, they pay the taxes, both land tax and a capitation tax, and sometimes other indemnities that are required by treaties and things like this. And so if they convert, then you undermine the tax base that supports kind of the warrior elite of the early empire. This doesn't really last more than a century, but that's basically the system. But what they end up doing, I think, maybe accidentally in a way, is they create a culture and a religion and an ethnicity of imperial prestige that a large number of the conquered population wants to assimilate to, and they want to get on that gravy train too. And so that transforms the nature of the states run, that transforms the way that the religion is understood and things like that. And whether or not that universalistic kernel was there originally is a matter of debate. Of course, most modern Muslims would say yes, this is a message for all humanity and things like that. But the idea of the Arabs as a special people, even a sort of a chosen people, is also a very important idea very early on.
Yeah, I'm alluding here, I guess, in a way, like my own perception is, the Umayyad Caliphate, which up until about 750, AD, from reading your book and also like Hoyland's, but other books, it also seems even within the Umayyad period, which I think like say 660 to 750, right? There's like a first part of it, maybe the first third, where it was really, really Arab.
Yeah,
And then like the last 2/3, there's like stepwise transitions, my perception of something more recognizably as Islam beyond Arabness.
Yeah.
And then when you had the Abbasids after 750, that really kicked into hyper. So, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, you can disagree with me here, obviously. You're the expert, but it's like what I explain to people is a lot of things, So, for example, I don't, listeners know this, like, my well, actually on both sides, I come from a lineage of imams, right? There's a lot of imams in my family. And what do they do day to day? I mean, they're like making rulings and judgments. They're not doing theology or whatever. I mean, that's just not a big deal, So, I mean, where does this come from? And a lot of it, I feel, is like later on, as the religion is spreading to all these different people in all these different contexts, you have to have like, a whole like legal basis on how to live your life, Whereas like the early Arabs, I mean, whether they live in the town or, they're Bedouins or whatever, they're tribal people, they have their own customary law, like, you don't need all of this elaboration. And so a lot of the things that people live their lives in Islam, it's relative. I would say it's like, dates to the Abbasids. It dates to a period when you have a multicultural. You would say it's multicultural. It is multicultural empire. Whereas the early, Arab empire was a literally Arab empire, and it was just, it was like a militarized tribes atop an older Byzantine and Iranian structure.
Yeah, that's more or less correct. I mean, I think that's a good way of saying it. The one thing that's interesting about that is explaining the persistence of Arab identity, persistence of their religion, the persistence of their language. They're not like the Franks or the Goths and stuff like that assimilated to Christianity, that assimilated to Roman law and things like that. Roman law and Sassanid law does have influence on early administration of the caliphate and things like that, of course, but you do have your own law code and things like that. And I think the other thing that's key is that Arab men were very prolifically exogamous in their marriages and things like that. And so as the generations that of the conquerors begin to go, they're a very mixed population. They're very multilingual. They have connections with the local populace, as well as with, of course, the Arab past. But really, the Arab past is increasingly out of reach for them in some ways. I mean, we have anecdotes of some of the sons of the caliphs can barely speak Arabic and things like that. I mean, this is kind of a modern joke too about, some of the rulers of the Arab countries, like they go to Oxford and they go to university, but they never get proper Arabic. And so they can't deliver speeches in good Arabic and things like that. But I think one thing that is compelling about what the Arabs bring with them in terms of the conquest is, they I hesitate to use the word because sometimes it's misattributed, but there's a really amazing American historian by the name of David Hackett Fisher, and he has this book called Albion Seed, and he follows the migrations of basically English people from specific regions in England and as they kind of settle in the Americas, and he's able to show how they have certain what he calls folkways that they bring with them and that persist, that migrate and even become more conservative in some ways in the context of colonial America. And these are like how people cook, how people build their homes, how people talk, how people get married, how people get divorced, how they do their, funerals and all sorts of things like that. The names that they bring with them. These sorts of things persist for a very long time. And I think a lot of those kind of folkways that were part of the early Muslims become codified as Islamic law. Why do you get married the way that you do? Why do you have a janazah or the funeral way that you do? Why do you get buried the way that you do? And go all the way back to these folkways of these early Muslim conquerors. Of course, even those changed with local context over time with the spread of Islam. But their persistence all the same, I think it's really impressive.
Well, so Joe Henrich, evolutionary anthropologist at Harvard now, he told me parallel cousin marriage. Marriage of the offspring of brothers basically spread with Islam. And you can actually see, it hasn't been published yet, but he's already talked about it, so I can talk about it, you can see it in Central Asia. You can see in the genetic, as you're sampling people, you can start to see evidence of consanguinity, like at specific dates, which clearly correlate with the spread of Islamic practice in a previously Zoroastrian, Buddhist, whatever population. And so, if we get enough, because Arabs, because Islamic populations vary.
Yeah.
So we can get the DNA. We can actually track. You can probably eventually track the rate of Islamicization by looking at various things and you were talking about the exogamy. You would be able to see Arab. Most of the Sayyids that I've seen in the Indian subcontinent are fake, but a large minority are not. Actually, so you could actually track
the chromosome relatively. Is it reliably trackable? If you have,
the Hashemites have it. The Hashemites have a branch of it's like J1. Hashemites have it. There's still arguments about which one is the Muhammad one. Some people say it's something different, but it's what the Hashemites have, and I think it's what the royal family in Morocco has. It's the same branch, and so that's strongly suspicious. If they both say they're descended and they both have the same one, and they have the best validated genealogies, and this is the one that I think it's a third of the ones that I've seen from the Indian subcontinent have this one, and it's not one that's common beyond the Arab world, actually. Well, aside from the Sayyids, right? So probably it is a real genealogy.
Yeah.
And so anyway, these are just interesting external ways. I've tried to convince rich people in the Gulf to fund the Sayyid project, and so
it's a bunch, one of the ways that so there's this old debate about there's a rival caliphate that's established in North Africa, and eventually they found Cairo called the Fatimids, and it's a really long dispute about whether or not their claims to be descended from the Prophet Muhammad through Ali and Fatima are correct. That is Muhammad's daughter and his cousin and son-in-law. And I would wonder if you can get the Aga Khan family to see if they got the right one.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
so I will tell you, this is like listeners know this. Y chromosome. So Y chromosome obviously is the paternal lineage.
Yeah.
It's got like 200. It's got like not 200,000, but it's got like millions of variants. Whatever. It's a small chromosome, but you don't need that many markers to do most of the haplogram typing. But if you want to get really, really fine grained, you sequence the whole thing, and that costs some money. It costs like hundreds of dollars, whatever. It could cost thousands if you want to really get a really good sequence. And I know that in the Persian Gulf is where a lot of the demand for that is because they want to construct their genealogies. Yeah. And this is like a story I tell people is like, I have a friend who was like making money off this. And I was like, wait, what if you find out that it's not correct and, something was going on? Wouldn't that cause like massive issues? Like, aren't you worried about that? Yeah. And he said, it's never happened. Yeah. So, basically, that's basically like validates that Arabs are very, very, those Arab peoples are very, very into mate guarding, and it works. Yeah. That's never happened. The other thing is like, I've told this story too before. I had some acquaintances. Well, I mean, we're friends. But it was almost 20 years ago now. They went to the UAE and they did some preliminary sequencing on those UAE citizens, and it was for some consulting thing, whatever. They gave them a lot of money, whatever. They're British scientists, and they got like really high inbreeding values to the point where they thought that they were making an error because they'd never seen these values. Wow. And so they were really scared to tell these like rich sheiks that were funding them. And so they drew straws, and the guy who drew the short straw like told them, and he was like super stressed out. And like the sheik was like, so what you're trying to say is like our women were faithful. He's like,
there you go. That's a good.
The guy was not mad at all because it's not like they're not stupid. They have genealogies that say that they've been marrying their cousins for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And so you're trying to say that the genetics confirms we've been marrying. Okay, yeah. I mean,
Yeah, that's good.
I mean, they're aware of the problems. Like they're funding things and all this stuff. They're aware of the problems, but it's also like it's not like it's saying anything that's totally it's like totally follows their cultural script, like a lot of the genetic evidence. Yeah. But going back to like the text and all this stuff, in terms of as you've been doing your research, you mentioned like your own advisor has certain ideas. What has been the biggest surprise about studying the research? These texts about Muhammad and his life. What is for you as a scholar? In your career, like in this field.
Yeah. This, I can talk about the Quran since we talked a lot about that. So, if you read like the literary accounts of the compilation of the Quran and all the different accounts of like the different versions of the Quran and things like that. So maybe I should step back a bit and be clear. So there's all sorts of stories in early Arabic literature about how the Quran was compiled, who compiled it, and what even the Quran looked like, and what were in the Qurans that were compiled by people who knew the Prophet Muhammad, but were not this third caliph, this Caliph Uthman, that compiled the official version. And when you read those accounts, you're like, man, this text is a mess. It is like a sloppy mess. If only we would have these early manuscripts, we're going to find really a very unstable text. And what has been most surprising to me is, and this is one of the major things that has revolutionized our field, is you can go on the website now. It's called corpuscoronica.de for Deutschland, for Germany. And you can look at most of our earliest manuscripts of the Quran on there. You can just go through them. I was really shocked to find how regular they were. So in terms of their preservation and things like that, much more regularly and carefully copied than, say, our earliest copies of the New Testament. The New Testament is very well preserved, but in terms of the number of variants and things like that, and they're much lower. The New Testament has some famous passages that were probably not a part of the original. Probably the most famous one is the story of the woman caught in adultery. Like, doesn't originally belong to that gospel. But you don't have any big, huge parts of the text that are missing or excised from the earliest manuscripts or anything like that. I was generally surprised and impressed subsequently about how well and stable that text was. The other thing I think that I've been surprised about is the immense value of not just the official epigraphy that was put up by caliphs, governors, and stuff when they're building their fancy projects and markets and stuff like that, but in general, how literate it seems that the Arabs were in the Hejaz after the rise of Islam. The amount of epigraphy and the amount of writings that we have just on the face of stones is extraordinary, and it's an amazing kind of testament to this huge cultural transformation that Islam brought about. I mean, and it's very distinct from the pre-Islamic epigraphy that we get in Arabia and from Arabians. Yeah, prior to that.
All right. Okay, so I mean, as we're like winding down, I've been talking to you for a while. I just want to ask you a bunch of questions, like kind of about the state of the field from your perspective. Obviously, it's your perspective, but whatever. You can read this stuff, which unlike 99.999% of people out there, in terms of like various controversial things that I've heard, and like let's talk a little bit about Tom Holland's documentary. I watched some of it, but I mean, it seems like to me, it wasn't revolutionary. It seems like it was like reflecting like certain scholars, what they were saying a generation ago. So, for example, this idea that Arabia was actually heavily Christianized before the rise of Islam. I've read that, I've read people have been writing this like as of the last year. I've seen like, press releases about this. And so basically in the Quran, or at least in like, Islamic tradition, basically the Quraysh are like pagan and, it's the Jahiliyyah and all this stuff. And there are some Christians and Jews, but it's not like they dominate the scene. Whereas, the revision, I'm not going to say revisionist, but the revision that I'm getting in some of this scholarship is actually Christianity and, obviously Judaism, if Yemen is Jewish, are all over the place in Arabia, and there weren't really that many pagans left. What do you say about that?
Yeah. So this gets to a mystery. So yeah, the Christianity was present in northern Arabia. Also, it should be clear, like what we're talking about when we mean Arabia. Arabia is a province of the Roman Empire. It's Provincia Arabia, and its capital is Bosra, which is today in southern Syria. And it kind of extends, however far that the Romans feel like extending it, into the northern parts of Arabia. But it also is a word for the entire peninsula. So the peninsula also is gigantic. It's basically the size of the subcontinent. It's the size of India. So when I say that there's some communities that are located, they could be very far away from one another. So on eastern part of Arabia, we have lots of churches, lots of monasteries that have been discovered. We discovered some monastic communities in northern Arabia, but South Arabia is where all the action was taking place really in the 6th century. It was the site of a huge international crisis with a Jewish kingdom that was established there called Himyar, and then is conquered by the Christian Ethiopians, and there's sort of a sort of minor religious war down there that brings in both the Persians and the Romans, like the Americans and the Russians at the time, I guess. And that's more or less over by the time the rise of Islam happens. But what it gives us this view of Arabia where, maybe paganism existed still, but it was monotheism, and its Jewish and Christian versions were exerting a lot of pressures, and it seemed like it was inevitable that eventually Christianity would take over and do away with paganism like it had elsewhere, and like it was doing in Europe, for example, simultaneously, but not yet completely done so. But if we read the early Muslim accounts of Arabia, it's full of idolatry. It's full of polytheism. There's no Christians or Jews hardly to be found anywhere except for Medina. And archaeologically speaking, epigraphically speaking, and we're still doing this, so this might be overturned. We don't find that. We find that the pagan inscriptions disappear centuries before the rise of Islam, and we don't really find any evidence of the Hijaz as a pagan reserve. Now, the Quran is full of polemics against idolatry and polytheism and things like that. Something's going on. But that's enough that I don't think the field is sufficiently cracked yet in terms of what was the real beef about between Muhammad and his opponents. It's still a real mystery. Yeah, I guess, does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does, and, which is, yeah, I mean, because, I mean, it's, with history, it's also interesting how people will interpret things. So I've read things where there's stuff about Sweden being pagan relatively late, in Scandinavia. And then I read a revisionist work that said actually they weren't pagan; they were Orthodox Christians that had come back from Russia. Yeah. And I was just like, okay, like I don't know how to interpret this. And no offense, but in academia, you always got to produce something new, which I think maybe we need to change that rule sometimes, because maybe sometimes we just know what the reality is, right?
I mean, sometimes the way that I tend to try to evaluate that stuff is, I think a good historian, at least, will be pretty transparent about what they're interpreting in order to arrive at their conclusions, right? So it's like, this is the inscription that I'm reading. It's from these many inscriptions that I'm determining this stuff from. And if they're not being transparent, or if they are constantly referring to the consensus says, or scholarly opinion knows, or if they use the word "of course," is almost always an indication that they don't.
Why is that clause there?
Yeah.
Why is that clause there?
Yeah.
Okay, so the second question that I have is actually about so you mentioned the Hijaz, and I probably should have just interrupted you, just because a lot of people don't have a mental map of Arabia. All right, so you got this big Arabian Peninsula. I think everyone knows what it's shaped like. In the far south, you have Yemen. That's where a lot of people are. They could grow crops and everything like that. There are kingdoms in Yemen. We know about Yemen. It's interacting with Ethiopia. It's interacting with Persia and Rome. It's Arabia Felix. They're lucky. Right. Okay, and then in the north, you have the whole zone bordering Syria and Iraq today. Kind of that liminal zone between the desert and the towns and the river valleys is where Arabs have been, and they've been there. I mean, I think they've been there since 6th century BC. The early Assyrians, record Arab tribes, right? Arab peoples, whatever. The whole discourse about the ethnicity that we don't need to get into, but you alluded to it. It's confusing.
The word is there. People are.
Yeah, the word is there. Okay, so they're there, and you have the Lakhamids and the Ghassanids, who are these two Arab kind of confederacies, kingdoms, or whatever, and they're Christian already. Depending, some of them, they might be heretical forms of Christianity, but they're Christian, right?
Whatever. Find the Roman army.
Yeah, or the Roman and with the Persians as well. And so you have those two, and then you have the whole center. Okay, there's obviously the center east, which is empty. Okay, you were talking about the people in what is today Bahrain and stuff. There were people there. They've been there since the Bronze Age, and they're Christian by now. And then the key is you mentioned the Hijaz, and that's the area where Mecca and Medina are, that kind of center west, towards Yemen, but not quite that far. Okay, so this is where the action of early Islam supposedly goes. Now, there's a whole school of revisionism, and I don't know what the state is, which basically says, no, this is late, and actually Islam really emerged relatively further north, towards Jordan, Nabatea, that area. And then Mecca, it was not a big entrepot, it was not a big trade center, and all of these other issues. I don't know how to evaluate it. There's a lot of stuff in the Quran and in Muslim tradition that records battles and all these other things. And, there's no external validation, supposedly. The whole thing is just kind of confusing for an outsider. Because you just, I know that's a lot to throw at you, but
no.
So it's just a lot.
Yeah, but no, I would say, I'll try to simplify it like this. The reason why there's this push, or where there was this desire to say maybe Islam came up closer to Provincia Arabia, like we said, the Roman part of Arabia or Syria and stuff in general, is because the Quran itself shows a surprising amount of awareness of Christian traditions and Jewish traditions secondhand. And so it would seem like it would be more apt for the Quran to emerge from a Palestinian or a Roman Arabian context rather than the Hijaz. And so how do you explain that the Quran knows, well, it doesn't have a lot about Jesus, but it has two versions of the story of the nativity, the story of the Christmas story, basically, and the Annunciation to Mary and things like that. How do you explain that if they're, in the middle of the desert or something like that? And we don't have any pre-Islamic evidence for the existence of Mecca, really. But why would we? Also, on the other hand, it's kind of an obscure place. There was this old idea that I think still is dead. This was put forward by William Montgomery Watt. This idea that Mecca was this huge hub of trade, and it was like the center of the spice trade. And there's no evidence for that. It was a very poor place, had a very small population. And most of the battles, even in the Arabic sources, are like between, just a few hundred people. We're not talking about massive battles. Later on, when you get the stories of the battles of like the defeat of the Romans and stuff, you have crazy numbers cited in the sources, like 300,000, 100,000. That's totally nonsense. I mean, the Roman army in the East was probably maybe 20,000. And then you had like supporters and things like that they could muster together. I always describe, since I'm at Ohio State, I always says, Ohio State Stadium is over 100,000 people in it. It says, imagine trying to get 100,000 people marching, through the desert, number one, feeding everybody, and then having them fight. It's just a very large number, and it's not very practical. However, I think that now that the epigraphy of the Hijaz is opening up, I think we have a better leg to stand on in terms of understanding. Yeah, this is where everybody comes from. It's not very logical as to why Mecca would be chosen at a relatively late period as an important place and things like that. To me, it's never been explained to me in a way that I find very compelling. Like, why choose Mecca in the first place? I find Mecca already is mentioned in the Quran and things like that too. So. I just find that it's creating more problems of interpretation than it solves.
Yeah, it's when you add it's like when you add facts or variables that remove clarity is what you're alluding to, where it's like it feels very, it seems like it's adding opacity. So I guess the last big question I want to ask you is just so there's a Tom Holland documentary about Islam, and I think he had a book about it, didn't he? Or was it just a documentary?
Yeah, he did. What was his book called? Was it The Sword?
So the documentary is Islam: The Untold Story, and it is released in the shadow of the sword.
That's right.
The battle for the global empire and the end of the ancient world.
Yeah.
And then that discussed the Arab Empire and the rise of Islam. Wikipedia entry says, however, many regarded this work as a conspiracy theory. Talk about this.
I haven't read Tom's book. I've read a lot of other Tom books. I think Tom is an amazing writer. He's actually one of my favorite writers in terms of like just really good at historical prose and making things come to life and things like that. But I haven't read that book. And when I saw the documentary, a lot of times I watch these documentaries to see like my friends and mentors interviewed and things like that. So one of my mentors was Patricia Crona, and like she's on there, and like I like just listen to her comments because I think they're funny and things like that. And I think that the documentary is a product of its time, and it would give you probably a really exciting introduction to some of the debates that were going on in the field and things like that. But it's
let me just say it came out in 2012, so of its time. It's probably a product of like the 2010 or 2010.
Yeah, exactly. So what my suspicion would be is that like I would say the mid 90s, late 90s was maybe peak skepticism in the field. And since it came out at around that time, it would probably be a really great time capsule of what the field was like then. And sort of the major transformation that had taken place in Quranic studies, and especially the newer stuff in epigraphy, that probably had not yet touched kind of the broader consciousness, even if somebody's well read like Tom Holland.
So basically, say it's a conspiracy theory or crankery is not correct. You're just saying to some extent it reflects like, kind of like a strain of the scholarship of that particular period.
Yeah, it's so far
All
as
right.
I remember it. I think maybe he did, and maybe it would be because this tends to happen in general. Maybe he did put his thumb on the scale of like the more skeptical side in general too, because it is fun. And the idea of like, ooh, we're going to get to like the secret history or the hidden aspect that you don't get in the conventional kind of boring, straightforward accounts. That's fun. I mean, it can be enjoyable. I mean, it does make people upset, I think, when it comes to religious stuff, because in particular, religious communities like to control their own narrative. They like to self-represent, and they get upset when they feel like they don't get a chance to represent themselves and that the narrative is taken away from them. And I think those feelings are understandable, and there might be political events or kind of cultural things that are happening in a given moment that exacerbate that. But yeah.
Well, so what are you working on right now? Like, what are you interested in? Like, what directions is your scholarship going?
Yeah. So doing a bunch of things, but I guess the most relevant thing, I'm gonna do another book. So my Muhammad book, I guess, was sort of my prolegumena type. Like, this is what I think is the state of the source material, and this is how to understand it. And I'm working on, and I would like to finish, I don't know when, a book on like Muhammad in the Quran, just a minimalist kind of biography of like, this is the basics that we know. This is the bread and butter, not sort of a narrative account or anything like that. Maybe boring, maybe not. Depends on what kind of history writing you like. But what I think are the most solid things that we can know, mostly using the Quran as the historical source. And then I'm doing other things too. I have a book coming out that I co-authored with Stephen Shoemaker on the Persian conquest of Jerusalem that happened in 614. We have an eyewitness account of that. And so we wrote a book translating that, introducing that. That'll be coming out this year. And also have a biography of an early Umayyad caliph that is almost done. His name's Omar ibn Abdulaziz. And so for whatever reason, he's the sole figure about whom a biography was written, the earliest person about whom a biography was written after the Prophet Muhammad. So I translated.
What years did he reign?
So he's early. He only reigns for like 30 months, and so it's like trying to remember like the dates in CE. It's like, what is the dates in CE? It's like 99 to 101 in the Hijri, so that's like 720 or something like that.
Okay.
So he's like the exceptional Umayyad caliph. So he's like the righteous guy. He's the one that.
Well, I mean, that's probably why the biography was written, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I thought he was kind of boring until I did this. Actually, to be perfectly honest, he died really young. He died, at least what I think is young now, 39. I mean, I'm getting to the point in my career where I'm realizing that I'm older than a lot of the caliphs that I write about, like older than Harun al-Rashid and all these guys. But in any case, yeah, that's the other one that I'm doing, and I got bunch of little tiny side projects. So.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking about your scholarship. It sounds really interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
It sounds like there's a lot going on. I'm not going to say it's the easiest book to read, but your book on Muhammad that I read, it's not that long. That's a lot of academic books are like, using a computer science term, they're core dumps. Everything that a researcher knows, they're like, bro, we don't need this footnote to a footnote. So, as scholarly books go, I will commend that it is well written on a difficult to access topic. I probably have a little bit more familiarity with the topic than most of my listeners, so just beware about that.
Sort of maybe not the first book you read about Islam, but maybe the second.
yeah. Anyway, thank you for your time, man.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
Even if you and your partner are healthy, there's still a chance your child can develop a serious genetic disease. This is because every embryo has new changes not present in either parent. Most of the time, these are benign, but sometimes they can be catastrophic. Orchid's whole genome embryo reports directly screen the embryo and analyze these de novo genetic mutations. Discuss embryo screening and IVF with a genetics expert.
This podcast for kids